My name is Andrea Pennington. I'm an integrative physician, acupuncturist, best-selling author, and international speaker. My career in broadcast and digital media spans over 20 years. As past medical director for Discovery Health Channel, I've had multiple appearances on Oprah, Dr. Oz, and CNN, and my TED Talks have reached 2.5 million people. For the last several years, I've been helping other doctors, dentists, healers, and coaches from around the world to share their messages with global audiences through personal branding, publishing, online courses, and media training. And what makes this combination unique is that I am bringing my 20 years of expertise as a professional speaker and coaching other people on their TED-style talks. So I know what it takes to craft a keynote, a TED Talk, and even workshop presentations so that you communicate your message with confidence and clarity. Hello, beautiful soul. Be aware, this is your trigger warning. In this episode, we are discussing suicide. If this is an issue that may provoke strong feelings of overwhelm, anxiety, or fear, you may wish to skip this episode. Of course, we do treat the subject very sensitively, as my guest and I have both had experiences with suicide, but if it's sensitive for you, please take care of yourself. It is such a joy to welcome you, Pia Prana Muggerud from Norway. Thank you for agreeing to have this conversation with me.
Oh, it's such an absolute pleasure, and I'm so excited about having this conversation with you, and especially because, as I said to you as we were preparing for the interview, I've been following you and listening to some of your teachings. And now I get to really have a conversation with you about some of the topics that I think are dear to both of our hearts. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's my pleasure. And I was so grateful to be a part of your summit. So we're just, sharing the love.
Yeah.
Well, there are a couple of things that we also share in common. And that is growing up with a dysfunctional family. As I understand, there was alcoholism and depression or addiction and depression in your family, and that the way that you responded to that, everybody responds to childhood dysfunction differently, but you and I have something in common. The way you responded to that was to become the good girl, and in that process you lost some of your authentic voice. And tell me a little bit about what it was like for you, and then we'll talk about the epiphanies that led you to reclaiming your voice.
Yeah. It was almost like being a fish in water, and the fish don't see the water. So there was a lot of how I learned to be in the world. I just thought that's how things should be. And I very often I quote my relationship with my beautiful cousin, who's very much chose a different route. She's very fiery, she's outspoken, and she really got a lot of flack. She was so for me, being the little silent, not making a peep, just agreeing and doing as I was told. Very often the kind of acceptance I got in that was just that I didn't get any challenges in my direction. Therefore, I would just stay silent, and therefore part of my role, I think, was to keep the peace. And there were many parts of our household that weren't so peaceful. It wasn't a constant thing, but certainly a daily and weekly basis. And I think in my little head when I was growing up, I just thought that I've got to find a way that I can make things better. I think I internalized part of what was going on in the family at large, and I looked for ways that how I can maybe overcome, I think, the internal shame that I'd also developed inside. and I was so helpful. I didn't say a peep. If somebody told me this is what I have to do, I would do it. I never once rebelled. I mean, the amount of friends of mine that have told me about how they rebelled, and I never once put my foot down to anything.
Well, I know how that goes. It's like I also, in response to the way that I was parented, I became the good girl. And it wasn't just that I chose to be silent. Like my mother literally said, children are to be seen, not heard. So to keep the peace, to not get punished, I was the good girl. I obeyed. I made sure I got really good grades in school. And I didn't rebel until much, much, much later in life. But I love how you shared in this book, She Rises for Tomorrow, your chapter about your kind of awakening. Like it's a process of awakening and reclaiming your authentic self and your voice. But you described a part of you as a rebel. So take us to how you had, got this degree. You went off to Scotland. Like take us through a piece of this journey.
Yeah. I look back at so many of the decisions I made in my life, and it was always a my feelers were facing outwards, not facing inwards, not checking in with here. I was checking outwards. And as I completed my studies, rightly so, in beautiful Edinburgh in Scotland, there was this sense of there really was a sense of emptiness. Like there's something that just isn't quite right. And and when I got this invitation to travel halfway across the world, I I never thought in a million years that I would go to China, to Hong Kong. But there was, and the rebel that you mentioned is, there was something that was kind of waking up inside, that there's got to be more to this. And I realized that I needed to really take a big leap of faith. And although I wasn't at the time, in that moment, I wasn't planning on staying in Hong Kong for a quarter of a century. I was going for a couple of months. But even just that, that step, it kind of feels like, when you talk about the hero's journey, it kind of felt like a big part of being able to take such a big leap. There was something inside of me that needed more space. And in fact, back then I used to talk about how I needed to be able to breathe more. That there was something inside of this box that I existed inside of, there just wasn't enough oxygen. So traveling all the way across to Hong Kong, um, later showed me that, oh, there was this, whew,
Like you could
something
exhale.
open. Yes. And even, and just take in the air that I felt like I needed, because somehow there was a restriction inside, that this rigidity of the good girl that I'd played for so long. And yes, so I 24 25 years ago, I got on a plane from a invitation from a dear friend to say, do you want to come and visit? And I jumped on that plane, and of course I was scared, but there was something inside that needed, it almost wasn't a decision, it was something that I was being pulled towards, that led me on the beginning of that big adventure.
Well, I love how in your story in the book you share how there are these different parts of you and different voices. So the rebel was like, I'm doing this, I'm taking this. And even when you got there and you were kind of like, a little bit of culture shock, the good girl spoke up again and was like, no, 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 you're going to have to see this through. So I wonder, when you say that there was this part of you that was like pulling you forward, do you think that that was just yourself, your true self, without all the masks and protectors? It was like saying, look, I need to live my truth. And part of it is going to be found by leaving your Europe, right?
Yeah, it certainly was. And I also wasn't accustomed to listening to that voice. But I think that a combination of circumstances in that at that moment, that little voice came up for air for actually at the time a very short moment, because of course when I found myself sitting on the bus on the way from the airport going, holy, what have I just done? All the fear and all the uncertainty came back. And it actually took quite a bit longer before that voice started getting a little bit more airtime again. But that at the moment, that was all I needed. That connection, like connecting the dots where there's something else. And I need to do this almost from a sense of this urgency of, to really survive, I got to take this journey, this I suppose hero's journey. And yeah, it did take me a great deal longer to revisit then that voice inside, because I was so familiar with the good girl.
Yeah, yeah. I know. I know it well. And so,
Hmm.
how much did did you battle with yourself at all, knowing that you were leaving your parents behind? I understand that your mom was suffering with mental illness, because that came up in your first year over in Hong Kong. So tell us about that.
You know, my mom had struggled for many years, and and this was also part of the whole kind of dysfunction inside of the family, was that this was really not talked about. And especially my mum would say things like, we don't talk about anything outside of these four walls. And that also, I think, as somebody growing up and somebody who's wanting to be a good person and have integrity, there was already something really not okay with the kind of hiding and not really speaking up about things. And so with my mum's challenges, she was on and off medication for quite some time. And when she did finally, you know, she went into psychosis. And and then she ended up on a cocktail of antidepressants, antipsychotic medication, and she was never really the same ever again. And by that, and of course you would understand this, but really with such a strong combination of drugs, there was a real sort of, she was not, wouldn't ever get too high, and she used to be the life and soul of the party. She wasn't always depressed. She was somebody that people loved to be with. People were attracted to her, and she could like hold court at a party. So there were many aspects to my mum. But I think also in her case, she also grew up in her little box. um and and I think also with that generation, I suppose, you don't talk about things. There's way too much shame to share what's really going on. Whereas I think now, as it's becoming much more common that, and hopefully, things like mental health issues, we can talk about it more readily. And this is one of the things that I feel really passionate about. So for example, when you ask me, are there any topics off limits, I'm like, no, I really want to be a voice where, to share with people that, you know, you might look at Andrea or me and go, wow, they, you know, they're so great, or they have success, or whatever illusion you might make up, what story you might make up about us. And then you and we share about the difficulties. And I guess that's one of the many things that I learned about growing up in a family where things weren't talked about, and there was shame around it, and then all sorts of coping mechanisms that would allow us to kind of function day to day. So I don't think I answered your question. I'm sorry about that. I
No,
kind of
you
went on a
did.
little bit of a
You
rant.
did. Well, I know that, having read your story, I know that when you went to Hong Kong and you sort of were trying to figure things out. You got a job, got fired a few times, you're figuring things out. And then you got this phone call from your father, and you could tell that something was just not right. And it sounds like that part of you, just as you said, that you developed all these coping mechanisms. One of it was the peacekeeper. And you said that as you were flying back, or you kind of knew that you were going to go back into that caretaking role, right?
Yes. Um, and I knew that. And that was also really a kind of, we looked at it from a perspective of who will be able to actually step into that role at that moment. And on a practical level, I was able to do that. And of course, I also wanted to be there. But then all the other things were very, very familiar to me. You know, if I even go back in time, I would say that there was very much a so-called parentification or role reversal with my mother very often, where I would function as her friend. I would function as her, not necessarily a caretaker back in time, but certainly she would come to me and she would share as she would with an adult friend, like a best friend, sharing about the things she was going through with my father, sharing about the things that were difficult for her. And then when I fly back to Norway, because my mom really is deep into this psychosis, her decline had actually been withheld because I guess my dad and my brother had decided I needed to be protected rather than informed and allowing me to be part of the process that the family was going through. So by the time I got the call, she had actually, I kind of say, she'd gone somewhere else. She was not, when I then walked through the door, she was not there. And, typical things of not wanting to wash. And I even remember one time she was pouring a bath, and then she switched it off and there was like 2 inches worth of water. And I said, but Mom, you need to wash. No, that she just wasn't there. And so all the sort of typical caretaking things, or typical things that I was used to being this good girl for my mom, it was very easy at the time. But of course, as a family, we were very much in, scrambling, and this is actually quite a trauma to go through this, and especially with everything else that happened around. Between, my mom had to wait quite some time before she was able to get a spot in an institution, and between I landed and between she got into the hospital, we just had to keep her safe. And I was there during the day, and then my dad would come and kind of take part of the caretaking when he wasn't working.
Yeah, I think it is such a challenge for us that growing up with family dysfunction or addiction or mental health issues, that we as children, we do take on the caretaker, the parent role, the friend role, like you mentioned, the peacemaker, or the, I got to keep everything together at such an early age. And of course, we do that out of survival. We needed our family unit to survive. But the challenge is when those behaviors persist into our adult lives. So after a little episode there, you did return to Hong Kong, and you were starting to get your life together, including some trips to India and finding that authentic self. Tell us about that.
Well, the first step in what happened once my mother was safely hospitalized, and she was actually in a mental institution that I'd actually worked in before. And so I knew the place well. And in fact, I remember this one conversation when I was still in Norway with my dad, and he was like, I'm really hoping we don't have to institutionalize your mom. And I said, why not? The place is great. I know it really, really well. People, the patients that are there get really good care. But by the time I went back to Hong Kong, all the years of just living an inauthentic life just came crashing down. And my mum's illness was really a catalyst, but of course, really, it was just, I don't know how, 20 something years, I don't remember, but of years of just living a life that I thought I should. And so I guess I didn't really know it at the time, but in retrospect, it was very clear that I suffered a depression, and I spent days and days just crying and feeling such helplessness, and really I was almost like paralyzed. There was very little I can do. But then slowly, I was introduced to, say, books. I remember my very first introduction to India was this Indian meditation center, and they would do free positive thinking classes. So I went there, and that was actually my introduction to meditation. Yeah, and it was also such a godsend because I just needed something, and I was so lost. And so it started with reading, and then finally I was introduced to group work. And this is really where life just started going into multicolor, or my life and my inner world, because and especially then starting my annual trips to India, which was really inspired by a dear late friend who had traveled on her own to India when she was in her 20s. And I just thought, oh, that's amazing, and how could anybody do that? And then I think it was 2003, that was my first solo trip to India, not having planned to do meditation or do any kind of work like that, but existence or grace just kept on guiding me to all these masters, guiding me to all these places of, and of course, a journey like that is already quite not just an outer journey, but very much an inner journey. But starting to get introduced to India's multicolored and multifaceted, beautiful expression of the inner world, and of meditation, of grace, of a deeper connection with self. And that was really the first time I then ended up in this meditation center in Pune, India, which is the one place that just cracked my heart open. And that's where I've now, up until Corona, I've been returning there every year, and in fact also returning as a teacher and therapist there. But back then, it really opened up to work. One of the big pieces of work that I think saved my life is, alongside of meditation, is exposure work, where you literally, in a very safe container, let's imagine that you have a group of 5 people in front of you, and I stand up and I share what is most shameful. I go to the places where I least want to go, because if people know this about me, love will disappear forever. And that's obviously our shame voices that tell us about we're not enough or we won't be loved. And learning, to my great surprise, that as I'm mirrored back, there's love in people's eyes. There's connection. There's like compassion. I see you in me. And the great intimacy that was created. And that was one of the first simple yet most difficult tools that I was introduced to, that I started to learn that I could be loved when I was sharing my ugliest secrets, where I was being a brat, when I was, and all those things that are anything but,
Yeah.
This
Than
picture that we
what
bring
you
to the
used to
world.
be, than all the ways you were the good girl, to show up as your authentic self, the brat, the grief-stricken, the entitled, or whatever parts. So I think that's also why the 12-step group meetings are so helpful for people, and like the just that being able to share without judgment and to be witnessed is so helpful.
Although I haven't participated myself in 12-step, but a lot of my favorite work and favorite teachers are grounded in the 12-step programs and codependency, and I don't know if you've heard of the late John Bradshaw.
Of course.
He's like, I'm totally still in love with him. I'll still listen to his audios, and I will always learn something new. And there's just, I think also this piece around when you mention 12-step, this piece to really have a safe place to go, a safe place to land where there's not going to be any judgment, where you can feel like I will be accepted here no matter what. And that kind of healing inside is just there's no money that could buy that, you know, and that I'm eternally grateful for being guided. And I think that's where I also realized in India that I was connected to something bigger than myself, because as I was journeying and ending up in all these centers that with all these masters, etc., that I started to see that I also don't have to do life on my own, because there is something bigger that if I really stop and I really connect and I listen, I can be guided beyond just this little being that is just me.
Yeah, I love it. So you continue to make these journeys to India yearly, but back home in Hong Kong, you eventually did get another call from your father with not great news. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So I had on one trip to India, I had met the love of my life, and I was living in Hong Kong. He was living in Berlin, Germany, his hometown, and we started this whole, we call it a gypsy marriage, because I did actually end up marrying the guy. But at the time, we were mostly visiting each other, and he had just arrived back in Hong Kong, and we had got this little flat together that we were going to have for the summer, as we were still navigating our budding romance, and yeah, the phone rang, and I was very surprised to hear my dad's voice, because excuse me, because it was extremely early in Europe. And of course, the news that he gave me, he would never have wished to give me that news on the phone. But of course, I'm thousands of miles away. And he called me to say that my mother had ended her own life.
So was she then released from the hospital, that treatment
Yes,
center?
she was. Yeah, so in fact, this was about 10 years after she was hospitalized. And she wasn't, in fact, hospitalized for so long. It was only around 3.5 months. But ever since, she was on this cocktail of various pharmaceuticals that, yeah, she, like I said earlier, she wasn't so present. She wasn't really able to, and she never believed that she was ever able to stop those drugs. And sadly, she didn't really, she had a psychiatrist that was supporting her, but I remember her calling me up. I'm digressing a little bit, but I remember her calling me up one day and saying, "Hey, I've been communicating with my psychiatrist, and he said that there's nothing he can do for me." And the immense anger that I experienced in that moment, and of course I was raging on the phone to her, because in that moment I just couldn't hold it back. But this is also where, when I look back at the absolute privilege of the teachers and therapists, and I'm even noticing just tears could easily come, because of the privilege of the kind of therapists and teachers that I've been able to work with, that have helped me heal. has just been immense, and what's available in the world, as you will know very well, and for a professional to give that response that there's nothing we can do for you. And of course she's looking at this medical professional saying, well, oh, and I'm not saying that that led to the suicide, but of course there are when you're dealing with so much pain. You know, my mum experienced a great deal of childhood trauma. She experienced sexual abuse by her stepfather, and as a result, the stepfather wasn't sent away. She was sent away.
Oh my.
And she was 6 years old, and she ended up not growing up with her mum and not growing up with her twin brother.
Oh wow.
And she grew up with her loving but strict grandparents. And so you can imagine what she was carrying for so many years, and just never really having the support that she needed. And I know for myself, you know, I'm grateful that I'm not sitting here today with the feeling of I should have done something more, because at the end of the day, I was still the child, even if I was an adult as she passed away. But for her, it finally was too much to bear. I mean, she was barely leaving the house, and I don't think anyone should have to live that kind of life. And so I remember in the first few days, by the time I managed to get on a flight home, and my dad and I actually often have very intimate conversations. We can talk about things like this, but I remember him saying to me that actually I am sitting here also with a feeling of relief, and it was, I also felt good, and this might sound strange, but I also felt good for him that he was able to feel that and be able to say that, because she had spent so many years in so much pain and so much desperation. And my father he wasn't a full-time caretaker because he worked, but other than that, he was a caretaker also. And so it wasn't a life for either of them, but of course, especially for my mother. But coming back to suicide, you know, it's just such an extremely violent act, and the pain, of course, that is inflicted by to the rest of us is enormous. But of course, I would never in a million years point to my mother and say, you know, you shouldn't have done this. Look at the pain you've caused. And in fact, even the way that she ended her own life was she actually drowned herself, and she couldn't swim. She was desperately afraid of water. So that's even just another piece where life it's just too desperate. It's too unbearable. And so thankfully it wasn't my father that ended up finding her, which is probably my biggest thing that I'm what I'm most grateful for in such an impossible situation, because it was, you can imagine just how enormously difficult, not only everything that he had been going through over the years and also then this happening, but then having to call me, and then he called my brother, but he just said to my brother, who's also in Norway, so said, hey, your mum's got even worse, can you please come? Only as a way so they could be together when my dad gave him this news. But I guess one more thing I want to say about this is that because, you know, by the time my mum passed away, I had already been in deep and very committed inner journey of starting with counseling and going into therapy, both group and individual. I really had a place to land there. So inside of my pain, my grief, the suffering that came along with this, I had so many resources, including this wonderful therapist that I was still working with ongoing, that I can just land with him, back with him, and be held as I continued my journey, but especially then this with this impossible thing that happened with my mum.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, and my heart is with you and your father and your brother at such incredible loss and pain, and yes, relief. So I imagine that all of the work that you've done on yourself with therapy and the trips to India, all of it has led you to what you're doing today. Talk to us a little bit about your approach to healing and to being a coach.
Well, I think every step of my journey has led to not just my inner, finding this place where I guess I would say inner freedom more than anything. And of course that I suppose even deeper than that is love, but just this sense of this expansion inside that I can be big, I can be whoever I want to be, and I can do that in authenticity and with joy and with meeting the world, looking the world straight in the eye. And of course, so that was the main purpose of this journey. But of course, I trained as a coach back in 2002, and it was, although all the therapeutic trainings and I didn't actually end up as a counselor until probably about 5 years ago. But coming back to our mutual sort of commonality with our growing up, what I really the typical people that I love working with is specifically around the good girls. I call it like the good girl syndrome. So coming back to kind of the roles that we create as we grow up in dysfunctional families, which is rooted in codependency, but I specifically focus on the good girl, mainly because, of course, I know it inside out. And my approach, of course, is equal counseling or coaching and bringing in meditation. But what I have learned along the way, and what I've then brought into my work, is that I see again and again people using the outside world to give them cues about how to live. And so I actually call the work I do my inner compass, because what we work with is to then, all right, let's go in, and there is the true compass. That's where this is the direction I need to go in this moment. So I very much work with embodiment practices and part of what I'm trained to do is something called biodynamic breath and trauma release, which is trauma informed work, and part of it is to get people back in the body, not just here, but actually include the rest. And so, of course, inside of that, I use things like breath work, and it's a very simple breath work or type of tool. I mean, there's so many different types of breath work, but it's activating the nervous system in a way that we actually trigger the the stress response, so that the body actually naturally starts moving in a way. It could be anything from just stretching to actually shaking it out, just like animals do in nature when they release trauma. So a lot of that is also just getting familiar with the messages of the body, like the felt sense, getting familiar with excuse me, how the body can really guide us so deeply into our daily life and how we function. Another part, of course, is meditation. Often I might prescribe active meditations, because what I've also learned over the years is that we've got to move the body. We can't be stagnant. If we want to move stuck energy inside, we can't be couch potatoes and sitting at home. That's another big piece. And of course, things like creating healthy boundaries is actually, over the years, people come to me, and the one single common thread is that people lack healthy boundaries. And so that's another thing that is a part of the compass, to start getting a sense of, well, what's okay and what isn't. Because at the end of the day, healthy boundaries is really about teaching others how you would like to be treated, teaching others what's okay. And it starts with you knowing what's okay and what isn't. And I am a great example of not having healthy boundaries for so many years, and then allowing myself to either make decisions that's overriding my well-being, or allowing people to say or do things that wasn't okay. Like, for example, you mentioned getting fired one time, which if I had had any boundaries at the time, of course I would have put my foot down. I would have spoken up, but I had swallowed so much over the years. And speaking of swallowing, part of often what I prescribe when I work with people is exercises to start opening the throat chakra. And one of my favorite ways is to take, let's say, a kitchen towel, and you kind of make it into a little bit of a sausage. You put it in your mouth, bite, and you pull, and you scream. So you're engaging your jaw, but you're also engaging your throat. And it's a fantastic, empowering way to kind of just get up anything that's energetically swallowed. And my God, I swallowed for years.
Yeah, same here.
That's some of what I do.
Wow, you are just a treasure trove of wisdom and insight, and I love all of the practical side to what you do. Pia, I thank you so much for sharing your story with us, and congratulations on being published in this book, She Rises for Tomorrow. I will include a link in the description here of this meditation that you have created for people to tap into totally for free to start to experience some of Pia's work. Thank you.
Oh, and Andrea, thank you so much. I think we could have continued for another 3 hours.
Probably.
For now, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.